On Fairy Stories. J.R.R. Tolkien. Andrew Lang Lecture at the University of St Andrews, Scotland. March 8, 1939. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. This essay was originally intended to be one of the Andrew Lang Lectures at St Andrews, and it was, in abbreviated form, delivered there in 1938. To be invited to lecture in St Andrews is a high compliment to any man. To be allowed to speak about fairy stories is, for an Englishman in Scotland, a perilous honor. I felt like a conjurer who finds himself, by mistake, called upon to give a display of magic before the court of an elf king. After producing his rabbit, such a clumsy performer may consider himself lucky, if he is allowed to go home in proper shape, or indeed to go home at all. There are dungeons in fairyland for the overbold. And overbold I fear I may be accounted, because I am a reader and lover of fairy stories, but not a student of them, as Andrew Lang was. I have not the learning, nor the still more necessary wisdom, which the subject demands. The land of fairy story is wide and deep and high, and is filled with many things. All manner of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment, and an ever-present peril, both sorrow and joy as sharp as swords. In that land a man may, perhaps, count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very riches and strangeness make dumb the traveler who would report it. And while he is there it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates shut and the keys be lost. The fairy gold too often turns to withered leaves when it is brought away. All I can ask is that you, knowing these things, will receive my withered leaves, as a token that my hand at least once held a little of the gold. There are, however, some questions that one who is to speak about fairy stories must expect to answer, or attempt to answer, whatever the folk of fairy may think of his impertinence. For instance, what are fairy stories? What is their origin? What is the use of them? I will try to give answers to these questions, or such hints of answers to them as I have gleaned, primarily from the stories themselves, the few of all their multitude that I know. What is a fairy story? In this case you will turn to the Oxford English Dictionary in vain. It contains no reference to the combination fairy story, and is unhelpful on the subject of fairies generally.
In the supplement, fairy tale is recorded since the year 1750, and its leading sense is said to be, a tale about fairies, or generally a fairy legend, with developed senses, b, an unreal or incredible story, and c, a falsehood.
The last two senses would obviously make my topic hopelessly vast. But the first sense is too narrow. Not too narrow for an essay, it is wide enough for many books, but too narrow to cover actual usage. Especially so, if we accept the lexicographer's definition of fairies, supernatural beings of diminutive size, in popular belief supposed to possess magical powers and to have great influence for good or evil over the affairs of man. Supernatural is a dangerous and difficult word in any of its senses, looser or stricter. But to fairies it can hardly be applied, unless super is taken merely as a superlative prefix. For it is man who is, in contrast to fairies, supernatural, and often of diminutive stature, whereas they are natural, far more natural than he. Such is their doom. The road to fairyland is not the road to heaven, nor even to hell, I believe, though some have held that it may lead thither indirectly by the devil's tithe. O see ye not yon narrow road, so thick beset by thorns and briars? That is the path of righteousness, though after it but few inquires. And see ye not yon braid road, that lies across the lily leven? That is the path of wickedness, though some call it the road to heaven. And see ye not yon bonny road, that winds about yon ferny brae? That is the road to fair elfland, where thou and I this night maun gae. As for diminutive size, I do not deny that the notion is a leading one in modern use. I have often thought that it would be interesting to try to find out how that has come to be so, but my knowledge is not sufficient for a certain answer. Of old there were indeed some inhabitants of fairy that were small, though hardly diminutive, but smallness was not characteristic of that people as a whole. The diminutive being, elf or fairy, is, I guess, in England largely a sophisticated product of literary fancy. It is perhaps not unnatural that in England, the land where the love of the delicate and fine has often reappeared in art, fancy should in this matter turn towards the dainty and diminutive, as in France it went to court and put on powder and diamonds. Yet I suspect that this flower and butterfly minuteness was also a product of rationalization, which transformed the glamour of elfland into mere finesse, and invisibility into a fragility that could hide in a cowslip or shrink behind a blade of grass. It seems to become fashionable soon after the great voyages had begun to make the world seem too narrow to hold both men and elves, when the magic land of Henry Bressail in the west had become the mere Brazils, the land of red dye wood. In any case, it was largely a literary business in which William Shakespeare and Michael Drayton played a part. Drayton's Nymphedia is one ancestor of that long line of flower fairies and fluttering sprites with antennae that I so disliked as a child, and which my children in their turn detested. Andrew Lang had similar feelings. In the preface to the Lilac Fairy book he refers to the tales of tiresome contemporary authors. They always begin with a little boy or girl who goes out and meets the fairies of polyanthuses and gardenias and apple blossom. These fairies try to be funny and fail, or they try to preach and succeed. But the business began, as I have said, long before the 19th century, and long ago achieved tiresomeness, certainly the tiresomeness of trying to be funny and failing. Drayton's Nymphedia is, considered as a fairy story, a story about fairies, one of the worst ever written. The Palace of Oberon has walls of spiders' legs, and windows of the eyes of cats. And for the roof, instead of slats, is covered with the wings of bats. The knight Pigwiggon rides on a frisky earwig, and sends his love, Queen Mab, a bracelet of emmet's eyes, making an assignation in a cowslip flower. But the tale that is told amid all this prettiness is a dull story of intrigue and sly go-betweens. The gallant knight and angry husband fall into the mire, and their wrath is stilled by a draught of the waters of Lethe. It would have been better if Lethe had swallowed the whole affair. Oberon, Mab, and Pigwiggon may be diminutive elves or fairies, as Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot are not, but the good and evil story of Arthur's court is a fairy story rather than this tale of Oberon. Fairy, as a noun more or less equivalent to elf, is a relatively modern word, hardly used until the Tudor period. The first quotation in the Oxford Dictionary, the only one before AD 1450, is significant. It is taken from the poet Gower, as he were a Fairy. But this Gower did not say. He wrote as he were a Fairy, as if he were come from fairy. Gower was describing a young gallant who seeks to bewitch the hearts of the maidens in church. His crooked kemmed and thereon set a nouche with a chapelet, or one of green leaves, which late come out of the greaves. Alfre he shoulda seme fresh, and thus he looketh on the fdish. Right as an hawk which hath a sight upon the fowl there he shall lead. And as he were a Fairy, he steweth him to for hear ye. This is a young man of mortal blood and bone, but he gives a much better picture of the inhabitants of Elfland than the definition of a fairy under which he is, by a double error, placed. For the trouble with the real folk of fairy is that they do not always look like what they are, and they put on the pride and beauty that we would fain wear ourselves. At least part of the magic that they wield for the good or evil of man is power to play on the desires of his body and his heart. The Queen of Elfland, who carried off Thomas the Rhymer upon her milk-white steed swifter than the wind, came riding by the Eildon tree as a lady, if one of enchanting beauty. So that Spenser was in the true tradition when he called the knights of his fairy by the name of Elpha. It belonged to such knights as Sir Guyon rather than to Pigwiggon armed with a hornet's sting. Now, though I have only touched, wholly inadequately, on elves and fairies, I must turn back, for I have digressed from my proper theme, fairy stories. I said the sense stories about fairies was too narrow. It is too narrow, even if we reject the diminutive size, for fairy stories are not in normal English usage stories about fairies or elves, but stories about fairy, that is fairy, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. Stories that are actually concerned primarily with fairies, that is with creatures that might also in modern English be called elves, are relatively rare, and as a rule not very interesting. Most good fairy stories are about the adventures of men in the perilous realm or upon its shadowy marches. Naturally so, for if elves are true, and really exist independently of our tales about them, then this also is certainly true, elves are not primarily concerned with us, nor we with them. Our fates are sundered, and our paths seldom meet. Even upon the borders of fairy we encounter them only at some chance crossing of the ways. The definition of a fairy story, what it is, or what it should be, does not, then, depend on any definition or historical account of elf or fairy, but upon the nature of fairy, the perilous realm itself, and the air that blows in that country. I will not attempt to define that, nor to describe it directly. It cannot be done. Fairy cannot be caught in a net of words, for it is one of its qualities to be indescribable, though not imperceptible. It has many ingredients, but analysis will not necessarily discover the secret of the whole. Yet I hope that what I have later to say about the other questions will give some glimpses of my own imperfect vision of it. For the moment I will say only this, A fairy story is one which touches on or uses fairy, whatever its own main purpose may be, satire, adventure, morality, fantasy. Fairy itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic, but it is magic of a peculiar mood and power, at the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious, scientific, magician. There is one proviso: if there is any satire present in the tale, one thing must not be made fun of, the magic itself. That must in that story be taken seriously, neither laughed at nor explained away. Of this seriousness the medieval Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is an admirable example. But even if we apply only these vague and ill-defined limits, it becomes plain that many, even the learned in such matters, have used the term fairy tale very carelessly. A glance at those books of recent times that claim to be collections of fairy stories is enough to show that tales about fairies, about the fair family in any of its houses, or even about dwarfs and goblins, are only a small part of their content. That, as we have seen, was to be expected. But these books also contain many tales that do not even touch upon, fairy at all, that have in fact no business to be included. I will give one or two examples of the expurgations I would perform. This will assist the negative side of definition. It will also be found to lead on to the second question: what are the origins of fairy stories? The number of collections of fairy stories is now very great. In English none probably rival either the popularity, or the inclusiveness, or the general merits of the 12 books of 12 colors which we owe to Andrew Lang and to his wife. The first of these appeared more than 70 years ago, 1889, and is still in print. Most of its contents pass the test, more or less clearly. I will not analyze them, though an analysis might be interesting, but I note in passing that of the stories in this Blue Fairy book none are primarily about fairies, few refer to them. Most of the tales are taken from French sources, a just choice in some ways at that time, as perhaps it would be still, though not to my taste, now or in childhood. At any rate, so powerful has been the influence of Charles Perrault, since his Contes de ma Mère Louis were first Englished in the 18th century, and of such other excerpts from the vast storehouse of the Cabinet des Fées as have become well known, that still, I suppose, if you asked a man to name at random a typical fairy story, he would be most likely to name one of these French things, such as Puss in Boots, Cinderella, or Little Red Riding Hood. With some people Grimm's fairy tales might come first to mind. But what is to be said of the appearance in the Blue Fairy book of A Voyage to Lilliput? I will say this: it is not a fairy story, neither as its author made it, nor as it here appears condensed by Miss May Kendall. It has no business in this place. I fear that it was included merely because Lilliputians are small, even diminutive, the only way in which they are at all remarkable. But smallness is in fairy, as in our world, only an accident. Pygmies are no nearer to fairies than are Patagonians. I do not rule this story out because of its satirical intent. There is satire, sustained or intermittent, in undoubted fairy stories, and satire may often have been intended in traditional tales where we do not now perceive it. I rule it out because the vehicle of the satire, brilliant invention though it may be, belongs to the class of travelers' tales. Such tales report many marvels, but they are marvels to be seen in this mortal world in some region of our own time and space. Distance alone conceals them. The tales of Gulliver have no more right of entry than the yarns of Baron Munchausen, or than, say, the First Men in the Moon or the Time Machine. Indeed, for the Eloi and the Morlocks there would be a better claim than for the Lilliputians. Lilliputians are merely men peered down at, sardonically, from just above the housetops. Eloi and Morlocks live far away in an abyss of time so deep as to work an enchantment upon them. And if they are descended from ourselves, it may be remembered that an ancient English thinker once derived the very elves, through Cain from Adam. This enchantment of distance, especially of distant time, is weakened only by the preposterous and incredible time machine itself. But we see in this example one of the main reasons why the borders of fairy story are inevitably dubious. The magic of fairy is not an end in itself, its virtue is in its operations. Among these are the satisfaction of certain primordial human desires. One of these desires is to survey the depths of space and time. Another is, as will be seen, to hold communion with other living things. A story may thus deal with the satisfaction of these desires, with or without the operation of either machine or magic, and in proportion as it succeeds it will approach the quality and have the flavor of fairy story. Next, after travelers' tales, I would also exclude, or rule out of order, any story that uses the machinery of dream, the dreaming of actual human sleep, to explain the apparent occurrence of its marvels. At the least, even if the reported dream was in other respects in itself a fairy story, I would condemn the whole as gravely defective, like a good picture in a disfiguring frame. It is true that dream is not unconnected with fairy. In dreams, strange powers of the mind may be unlocked. In some of them a man may for a space wield the power of fairy, that power which, even as it conceives the story, causes it to take living form and color before the eyes. A real dream may indeed sometimes be a fairy story of almost elvish ease and skill, while it is being dreamed. But if a waking writer tells you that his tale is only a thing imagined in his sleep, he cheats deliberately the primal desire at the heart of fairy, the realization, independent of the conceiving mind, of imagined wonder. It is often reported of fairies, truly or lyingly, I do not know, that they are workers of illusion, that they are cheaters of men by fantasy, but that is quite another matter. That is their affair. Such trickeries happen, at any rate, inside tales in which the fairies are not themselves illusions. Behind the fantasy real wills and powers exist, independent of the minds and purposes of men. It is at any rate essential to a genuine fairy story, as distinct from the employment of this form for lesser or debased purposes, that it should be presented as true. The meaning of true in this connection I will consider in a moment. But since the fairy story deals with marvels, it cannot tolerate any frame or machinery suggesting that the whole story in which they occur is a figment or illusion. The tale itself may, of course, be so good that one can ignore the frame. Or it may be successful and amusing as a dream story. So are Lewis Carroll's Alice stories, with their dream frame and dream transitions. For this, and other reasons, they are not fairy stories. There is another type of marvelous tale that I would exclude from the title fairy story, again certainly not because I do not like it, namely pure beast fable. I will choose an example from Lang's fairy books, The Monkey's Heart, a Swahili tale which is given in the Lilac Fairy book. In this story a wicked shark tricked a monkey into riding on his back, and carried him halfway to his own land, before he revealed the fact that the sultan of that country was sick and needed a monkey's heart to cure his disease. But the monkey outwitted the shark, and induced him to return by convincing him that the heart had been left behind at home, hanging in a bag on a tree. The beast fable has, of course, a connection with fairy stories. Beasts and birds and other creatures often talk like men in real fairy stories. In some part, often small, this marvel derives from one of the primal desires that lie near the heart of fairy, the desire of men to hold communion with other living things. But the speech of beasts in a beast fable, as developed into a separate branch, has little reference to that desire, and often wholly forgets it. The magical understanding by men of the proper languages of birds and beasts and trees, that is much nearer to the true purposes of fairy. But in stories in which no human being is concerned, or in which the animals are the heroes and heroines, and men and women, if they appear, are mere adjuncts, and above all those in which the animal form is only a mask upon a human face, a device of the satirist or the preacher, in these we have beast fable and not fairy story, whether it be Renard the Fox, or the Nun's Priest's Tale, or Brer Rabbit, or merely the Three Little Pigs. The stories of Beatrix Potter lie near the borders of fairy, but outside it, I think, for the most part. Their nearness is due largely to their strong moral element, by which I mean their inherent morality, not any allegorical significatio. But Peter Rabbit, though it contains a prohibition, and though there are prohibitions in fairyland, as, probably, there are throughout the universe on every plane and in every dimension, remains a beast fable. Now the Monkey's Heart is also plainly only a beast fable. I suspect that its inclusion in a fairy book is due not primarily to its entertaining quality, but precisely to the monkey's heart supposed to have been left behind in a bag. That was significant to Lang, the student of folklore, even though this curious idea is here used only as a joke, for, in this tale, the monkey's heart was in fact quite normal and in his breast. Nonetheless, this detail is plainly only a secondary use of an ancient and very widespread folklore notion, which does occur in fairy stories, the notion that the life or strength of a man or creature may reside in some other place or thing, or in some part of the body, especially the heart, that can be detached and hidden in a bag, or under a stone, or in an egg. At one end of recorded folklore history this idea was used by George MacDonald in his fairy story The Giant's Heart, which derives this central motive, as well as many other details, from well-known traditional tales. At the other end, indeed in what is probably one of the oldest stories in writing, it occurs in the tale of the two brothers on the Egyptian Dorsini papyrus. There the younger brother says to the elder, "I shall enchant my heart, and I shall place it upon the top of the flower of the cedar. Now the cedar will be cut down and my heart will fall to the ground, and thou shalt come to seek it, even though thou pass 7 years in seeking it. But when thou hast found it, put it into a vase of cold water, and in very truth I shall live." But that point of interest and such comparisons as these bring us to the brink of the second question: what are the origins of fairy stories? That must, of course, mean the origin or origins of the fairy elements. To ask what is the origin of stories, however qualified, is to ask what is the origin of language and of the mind. Origins. Actually, the question, what is the origin of the fairy element, lands us ultimately in the same fundamental inquiry, but there are many elements in fairy stories, such as this detachable heart, or swan robes, magic rings, arbitrary prohibitions, wicked stepmothers, and even fairies themselves, that can be studied without tackling this main question. Such studies are, however, scientific, at least in intent. They are the pursuit of folklorists or anthropologists, that is, of people using the stories not as they were meant to be used, but as a quarry from which to dig evidence, or information, about matters in which they are interested. A perfectly legitimate procedure in itself, but ignorance or forgetfulness of the nature of a story, as a thing told in its entirety, has often led such inquirers into strange judgments. To investigators of this sort, recurring similarities, such as this matter of the heart, seem specially important. So much so that students of folklore are apt to get off their own proper track, or to express themselves in a misleading shorthand, misleading in particular, if it gets out of their monographs into books about literature. They are inclined to say that any two stories that are built round the same folklore motive, or are made up of a generally similar combination of such motives, are the same stories. We read that Beowulf is only a version of J.R.R., that the Black Bull of Norway is Beauty and the Beast, or is the same story as Eros and Psyche, that the Norse master-maid, or the Gaelic Battle of the Birds and its many congeners and variants, is the same story as the Greek tale of Jason and Medea. Statements of that kind may express, in undue abbreviation, some element of truth, but they are not true in a fairy story sense, they are not true in art or literature. It is precisely the coloring, the atmosphere, the unclassifiable individual details of a story, and above all the general purport that informs with life the undissected bones of the plot, that really count. Shakespeare's King Lear is not the same as Laman's story in his Brut. Or to take the extreme case of Red Riding Hood, it is of merely secondary interest that the retold versions of this story, in which the little girl is saved by woodcutters, is directly derived from Perrault's story in which she was eaten by the wolf. The really important thing is that the later version has a happy ending, more or less, and if we do not mourn the grandmother overmuch, and that Perrault's version had not. And that is a very profound difference, to which I shall return. Of course, I do not deny, for I feel strongly, the fascination of the desire to unravel the intricately knotted and ramified history of the branches on the tree of tales. It is closely connected with the philologist's study of the tangled skein of language, of which I know some small pieces. But even with regard to language, it seems to me that the essential quality and aptitudes of a given language and a living monument is both more important to seize and far more difficult to make explicit than its linear history. So with regard to fairy stories, I feel that it is more interesting, and also in its way more difficult, to consider what they are, what they have become for us, and what values the long alchemic processes of time have produced in them. In Descent's words, I would say, we must be satisfied with the soup that is set before us, and not desire to see the bones of the ox out of which it has been boiled. Though, oddly enough, Descent by the soup meant a mishmash of bogus prehistory founded on the early surmises of comparative philology, and by desire to see the bones he meant a demand to see the workings and the proofs that led to these theories. By the soup I mean the story as it is served up by its author or teller, and by the bones its sources or material, even when, by rare luck, those can be with certainty discovered. But I do not, of course, forbid criticism of the soup as soup. I shall therefore pass lightly over the question of origins. I am too unlearned to deal with it in any other way, but it is the least important of the three questions for my purpose, and a few remarks will suffice. It is plain enough that fairy stories, in wider or in narrower sense, are very ancient indeed. Related things appear in very early records, and they are found universally, wherever there is language. We are therefore obviously confronted with a variant of the problem that the archaeologist encounters, or the comparative philologist, with the debate between independent evolution, or rather invention, of the similar, inheritance from a common ancestry, and diffusion at various times from one or more centers. Most debates depend on an attempt, by one or both sides, at oversimplification, and I do not suppose that this debate is an exception. The history of fairy stories is probably more complex than the physical history of the human race, and as complex as the history of human language. All three things, independent invention, inheritance, and diffusion, have evidently played their part in producing the intricate web of story. It is now beyond all skill but that of the elves to unravel it. Of these three, invention is the most important and fundamental, and so, not surprisingly, also the most mysterious. To an inventor, that is to a storymaker, the other two must in the end lead back. Diffusion, borrowing in space, whether of an artifact or a story, only refers the problem of origin elsewhere. At the center of the supposed diffusion there is a place where once an inventor lived. Similarly with inheritance, borrowing in time, in this way we arrive at last only at an ancestral inventor. While if we believe that sometimes there occurred the independent striking out of similar ideas and themes or devices, we simply multiply the ancestral inventor but do not in that way the more clearly understand his gift. Philology has been dethroned from the high place it once had in this court of inquiry. Max Muller's view of mythology as a disease of language can be abandoned without regret. Mythology is not a disease at all, though it may like all human things become diseased. You might as well say that thinking is a disease of the mind. It would be more near the truth to say that languages, especially modern European languages, are a disease of mythology. But language cannot, all the same, be dismissed. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tail are in our world coeval. The human mind, endowed with the powers of generalization and abstraction, sees not only green grass, discriminating it from other things, and finding it fair to look upon, but sees that it is green as well as being grass. But how powerful, how stimulating to the very faculty that produced it, was the invention of the adjective. No spell or incantation in fairy is more potent. And that is not surprising, such incantations might indeed be said to be only another view of adjectives, a part of speech in a mythical grammar. The mind that thought of light, heavy, gray, yellow, still, swift, also conceived of magic that would make heavy things light and able to fly, turn gray lead into yellow gold, and the still rock into a swift water. If it could do the one, it could do the other, it inevitably did both. When we can take green from grass, blue from heaven, and red from blood, we have already an enchanter's power, upon one plane, and the desire to wield that power in the world external to our minds awakes. It does not follow that we shall use that power well upon any plane. We may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror, we may make the rare and terrible blue moon to shine, or we may cause woods to spring with silver leaves and rams to wear fleeces of gold, and put hot fire into the belly of the cold worm. But in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made, fairy begins, man becomes a sub-creator. An essential power of fairy is thus the power of making immediately effective by the will the visions of fantasy. Not all are beautiful or even wholesome, not at any rate the fantasies of fallen man. And he has stained the elves who have this power, in verity or fable, with his own stain. This aspect of mythology sub-creation, rather than either representation or symbolic interpretation of the beauties and terrors of the world, is, I think, too little considered. Is that because it is seen rather in fairy than upon Olympus? Because it is thought to belong to the lower mythology rather than to the higher? There has been much debate concerning the relations of these things, of folktale and myth, but, even if there had been no debate, the question would require some notice in any consideration of origins, however brief. At one time it was a dominant view that all such matter was derived from nature myths. The Olympians were personifications of the sun, of dawn, of night, and so on, and all the stories told about them were originally myths, allegories would have been a better word, of the greater elemental changes and processes of nature. Epic, heroic legend, saga, then localized these stories in real places and humanized them by attributing them to ancestral heroes, mightier than man and yet already man. And finally these legends, dwindling down, became folktales, Märchen, fairy stories, nursery tales. That would seem to be the truth almost upside down. The nearer the so-called nature myth, or allegory, of the large processes of nature is to its supposed archetype, the less interesting it is, and indeed the less is it of a myth capable of throwing any illumination whatever on the world. Let us assume for the moment, as this theory assumes, that nothing actually exists corresponding to the gods of mythology, no personalities, only astronomical or meteorological objects. Then these natural objects can only be arrayed with a personal significance and glory by a gift, the gift of a person, of a man. Personality can only be derived from a person. The gods may derive their color and beauty from the high splendors of nature, but it was man who obtained these for them, abstracted them from sun and moon and cloud. Their personality they get direct from him, the shadow or flicker of divinity that is upon them they receive through him from the invisible world, the supernatural. There is no fundamental distinction between the higher and lower mythologies. Their peoples live, if they live at all, by the same life, just as in the mortal world do kings and peasants. Let us take what looks like a clear case of Olympian nature myth, the Norse god Thor. His name is Thunder, of which Thor is the Norse form, and it is not difficult to interpret his hammer, Mjolnir, as lightning. Yet Thor has, as far as our late records go, a very marked character, or personality, which cannot be found in thunder or in lightning, even though some details can, as it were, be related to these natural phenomena, for instance, his red beard, his loud voice and violent temper, his blundering and smashing strength. Nonetheless, it is asking a question without much meaning, if we inquire, which came first, nature allegories about personalized thunder in the mountains, splitting rocks and trees, or stories about an irascible, not very clever, red-beard farmer, of a strength beyond common measure, a person, in all but mere stature, very like the northern farmers, the Bonder by whom Thor was chiefly beloved? To a picture of such a man Thor may be held to have dwindled, or from it the god may be held to have been enlarged. But I doubt whether either view is right, not by itself, not if you insist that one of these things must precede the other. It is more reasonable to suppose that the farmer popped up in the very moment when thunder got a voice and face, that there was a distant growl of thunder in the hills every time a storyteller heard a farmer in a rage. Thor must, of course, be reckoned a member of the higher aristocracy of mythology, one of the rulers of the world. Yet the tale that is told of him in Thrymskvotha, in the Elder Edda, is certainly just a fairy story. It is old, as far as Norse poems go, but that is not far back, say 8,900 or a little earlier, in this case. But there is no real reason for supposing that this tale is unprimitive, at any rate in quality, that is, because it is of folktale kind and not very dignified. If we could go backwards in time, the fairy story might be found to change in details, or to give way to other tales. But there would always be a fairy tale as long as there was any Thor. When the fairy tale ceased, there would be just thunder, which no human ear had yet heard. Something really higher is occasionally glimpsed in mythology, divinity, the right to power as distinct from its possession, the due worship, in fact religion. Andrew Lang said, and is by some still commended for saying, that mythology and religion, in the strict sense of that word, are two distinct things that have become inextricably entangled, though mythology is in itself almost devoid of religious significance. Yet these things have in fact become entangled, or maybe they were sundered long ago and have since groped slowly, through a labyrinth of error, through confusion, back towards refusion. Even fairy stories as a whole have three faces, the mystical towards the supernatural, the magical towards nature, and the mirror of scorn and pity towards man. The essential face of fairy is the middle one, the magical. But the degree in which the others appear, if at all, is variable, and may be decided by the individual storyteller. The magical, the fairy story, may be used as a mirror d'âme, and it may, but not so easily, be made a vehicle of mystery. This at least is what George MacDonald attempted, achieving stories of power and beauty when he succeeded, as in The Golden Key, which he called a fairy tale, and even when he partly failed, as in Lilith, which he called a romance. For a moment let us return to the soup that I mentioned above. Speaking of the history of stories and especially of fairy stories, we may say that the pot of soup, the cauldron of story, has always been boiling, and to it have continually been added new bits, dainty and undainty. For this reason, to take a casual example, the fact that a story resembling the one known as the Goose Girl, Die Gänsemarkt in Grimm, is told in the 13th century of Bertha Broadfoot, mother of Charlemagne, really proves nothing either way, neither that the story was, in the 13th century, descending from Olympus or Asgard by way of an already legendary king of old, on its way to become a Hausmärchen, nor that it was on its way up. The story is found to be widespread, unattached to the mother of Charlemagne or to any historical character. From this fact by itself we certainly cannot deduce that it is not true of Charlemagne's mother, though that is the kind of deduction that is most frequently made from that kind of evidence. The opinion that the story is not true of Bertha Broadfoot must be founded on something else, on features in the story which the critic's philosophy does not allow to be possible in real life, so that he would actually disbelieve the tale, even if it were found nowhere else, or on the existence of good historical evidence that Bertha's actual life was quite different, so that he would disbelieve the tale, even if his philosophy allowed that it was perfectly possible in real life. No one, I fancy, would discredit a story that the Archbishop of Canterbury slipped on a banana skin merely because he found that a similar comic mishap had been reported of many people, and especially of elderly gentlemen of dignity. He might disbelieve the story, if he discovered that in it an angel, or even a fairy, had warned the Archbishop that he would slip if he wore gaiters on a Friday. He might also disbelieve the story, if it was stated to have occurred in the period between, say, 1940 and 1945. So much for that. It is an obvious point, and it has been made before, but I venture to make it again, although it is a little beside my present purpose, for it is constantly neglected by those who concern themselves with the origins of tales. But what of the banana skin? Our business with it really only begins when it has been rejected by historians. It is more useful when it has been thrown away. The historian would be likely to say that the banana skin story became attached to the Archbishop, as he does say on fair evidence that the Goose Girl Märchen became attached to Bertha. That way of putting it is harmless enough, in what is commonly known as history. But is it really a good description of what is going on and has gone on in the history of story making? I do not think so. I think it would be nearer the truth to say that the archbishop became attached to the banana skin, or that Bertha was turned into the goose girl. Better still, I would say that Charlemagne's mother and the archbishop were put into the pot, in fact got into the soup. They were just new bits added to the stock. A considerable honor, for in that soup were many things older, more potent, more beautiful, comic, or terrible than they were in themselves, considered simply as figures of history. It seems fairly plain that Arthur, once historical, but perhaps as such not of great importance, was also put into the pot. There he was boiled for a long time, together with many other older figures and devices, of mythology and faerie, and even some other stray bones of history, such as Alfred's defense against the Danes, until he emerged as a king of faerie. The situation is similar in the great northern Arthurian court of the Shield Kings of Denmark, the Sildingas of ancient English tradition. King Hrothgar and his family have many manifest marks of true history, far more than Arthur, yet even in the older, English, accounts of them they are associated with many figures and events of fairy story, they have been in the pot. But I refer now to the remnants of the oldest recorded English tales of faerie, or its borders, in spite of the fact that they are little known in England, not to discuss the turning of the bear boy into the knight Beowulf, or to explain the intrusion of the ogre Grendel into the royal hall of Hrothgar. I wish to point to something else that these traditions contain, a singularly suggestive example of the relation of the fairy tale element to gods and kings and nameless men, illustrating, I believe, the view that this element does not rise or fall, but is there, in the cauldron of story, waiting for the great figures of myth and history, and for the yet nameless he or she, waiting for the moment when they are cast into the simmering stew, one by one or all together, without consideration of rank or precedence. The great enemy of King Hrothgar was Froda, king of the Heath-Obards. Yet of Hrothgar's daughter Freya-Waru we hear echoes of a strange tale, not a usual one in northern heroic legend. The son of the enemy of her house, Ingeld son of Froda, fell in love with her and wedded her, disastrously. But that is extremely interesting and significant. In the background of the ancient feud looms the figure of that god whom the Norsemen called Frey, the Lord, or Yngvi Frey, and the Angles called Ing, a god of the ancient northern mythology and religion, of fertility and corn. The enmity of the royal houses was connected with the sacred site of a cult of that religion. Ingeld and his father bear names belonging to it. Freya herself is named protection of the Lord, of Frey. Yet one of the chief things told later, in Old Icelandic, about Frey is the story in which he falls in love from afar with the daughter of the enemies of the gods, J.R.R., daughter of the giant Ymir, and weds her. Does this prove that Ingeld and Freya, or their love, are merely mythical? I think not. History often resembles myth, because they are both ultimately of the same stuff. If indeed Ingeld and Freya never lived, or at least never loved, then it is ultimately from nameless man and woman that they get their tale, or rather into whose tale they have entered. They have been put into the cauldron, where so many potent things lie simmering age-long on the fire, among them love at first sight. So too of the god. If no young man had ever fallen in love by chance meeting with a maiden, and found old enmities to stand between him and his love, then the god Frey would never have seen J.R.R. the giant's daughter from the high seat of Odin. But if we speak of a cauldron, we must not wholly forget the cooks. There are many things in the cauldron, but the cooks do not dip in the ladle quite blindly. Their selection is important. The gods are after all gods, and it is a matter of some moment what stories are told of them. So we must freely admit that a tale of love is more likely to be told of a prince in history, indeed is more likely actually to happen in an historical family whose traditions are those of Golden Frey and the Vanir, rather than those of Odin the Goth, the necromancer, glutter of the crows, lord of the slain. Small wonder that spell means both a story told, and a formula of power over living men. But when we have done all that research, collection and comparison of the tales of many lands, can do, when we have explained many of the elements commonly found embedded in fairy stories, such as stepmothers, enchanted bears and bulls, cannibal witches, taboos on names, and the like, as relics of ancient customs once practiced in daily life, or of beliefs once held as beliefs and not as fancies, there remains still a point too often forgotten, that is the effect produced now by these old things in the stories as they are. For one thing they are now old, and antiquity has an appeal in itself. The beauty and horror of the juniper tree, von dem Mackendelboom, with its exquisite and tragic beginning, the abominable cannibal stew, the gruesome bones, the gay and vengeful bird spirit coming out of a mist that rose from the tree, has remained with me since childhood, and yet always the chief flavor of that tale lingering in the memory was not beauty or horror, but distance and a great abyss of time, not measurable even by 2000 jar. Without the stew and the bones, which children are now too often spared in mollified versions of Grimm, that vision would largely have been lost. I do not think I was harmed by the horror in the fairy tale setting, out of whatever dark beliefs and practices of the past it may have come. Such stories have now a mythical or total, unanalyzable effect, an effect quite independent of the findings of comparative folklore, and one which it cannot spoil or explain. They open a door on other time, and if we pass through, though only for a moment, we stand outside our own time, outside time itself, maybe. If we pause, not merely to note that such old elements have been preserved, but to think how they have been preserved, we must conclude, I think, that it has happened, often if not always, precisely because of this literary effect. It cannot have been we, or even the Brothers Grimm, that first felt it. Fairy stories are by no means rocky matrices out of which the fossils cannot be prized except by an expert geologist. The ancient elements can be knocked out, or forgotten and dropped out, or replaced by other ingredients with the greatest ease, as any comparison of a story with closely related variants will show. The things that are there must often have been retained, or inserted, because the oral narrators, instinctively or consciously, felt their literary significance. Even where a prohibition in a fairy story is guessed to be derived from some taboo once practiced long ago, it has probably been preserved in the later stages of the tale's history because of the great mythical significance of prohibition. A sense of that significance may indeed have lain behind some of the taboos themselves. Thou shalt not, or else thou shalt depart beggared into endless regret. The gentlest nursery tales know it. Even Peter Rabbit was forbidden a garden, lost his blue coat and took sick. The locked door stands as an eternal temptation. Children. I will now turn to children, and so come to the last and most important of the three questions. What, if any, are the values and functions of fairy stories now? It is usually assumed that children are the natural or the specially appropriate audience for fairy stories. In describing a fairy story which they think adults might possibly read for their own entertainment, reviewers frequently indulge in such waggeries as, "This book is for children from the ages of 6 to 60. But I have never yet seen the puff of a new motor model that began thus, "This toy will amuse infants from 17 to 70, though that to my mind would be much more appropriate." Is there any essential connection between children and fairy stories? Is there any call for comment, if an adult reads them for himself? Reads them as tales, that is, not studies them as curios. Adults are allowed to collect and study anything, even old theater programs or paper bags. Among those who still have enough wisdom not to think fairy stories pernicious, the common opinion seems to be that there is a natural connection between the minds of children and fairy stories, of the same order as the connection between children's bodies and milk. I think this is an error, at best an error of false sentiment, and one that is therefore most often made by those who, for whatever private reason, such as childlessness, tend to think of children as a special kind of creature, almost a different race, rather than as normal, if immature, members of a particular family, and of the human family at large. Actually, the association of children and fairy stories is an accident of our domestic history. Fairy stories have in the modern lettered world been relegated to the nursery, as shabby or old-fashioned furniture is relegated to the playroom, primarily because the adults do not want it, and do not mind if it is misused. It is not the choice of the children which decides this. Children as a class, except in a common lack of experience they are not one, neither like fairy stories more, nor understand them better than adults do, and no more than they like many other things. They are young and growing, and normally have keen appetites, so the fairy stories as a rule go down well enough. But in fact only some children, and some adults, have any special taste for them, and when they have it, it is not exclusive, nor even necessarily dominant. It is a taste, too, that would not appear, I think, very early in childhood without artificial stimulus. It is certainly one that does not decrease but increases with age, if it is innate. It is true that in recent times fairy stories have usually been written or adapted for children. But so may music be, or verse, or novels, or history, or scientific manuals. It is a dangerous process, even when it is necessary. It is indeed only saved from disaster by the fact that the arts and sciences are not as a whole relegated to the nursery. The nursery and schoolroom are merely given such tastes and glimpses of the adult thing as seem fit for them in adult opinion, often much mistaken. Any one of these things would, if left altogether in the nursery, become gravely impaired. So would a beautiful table, a good picture, or a useful machine, such as a microscope, be defaced or broken, if it were left long unregarded in a schoolroom. Fairy stories banished in this way, cut off from a full adult art, would in the end be ruined. Indeed, in so far as they have been so banished, they have been ruined. The value of fairy stories is thus not, in my opinion, to be found by considering children in particular. Collections of fairy stories are, in fact, by nature attics and lumber rooms, only by temporary and local custom playrooms. Their contents are disordered, and often battered, a jumble of different dates, purposes, and tastes, but among them may occasionally be found a thing of permanent virtue, an old work of art, not too much damaged, that only stupidity would ever have stuffed away. Andrew Lang's fairy books are not, perhaps, lumber rooms. They are more like stalls in a rummage sale. Someone with a duster and a fair eye for things that retain some value has been round the attics and box rooms. His collections are largely a byproduct of his adult study of mythology and folklore, but they were made into and presented as books for children. Some of the reasons that Lang gave are worth considering. The introduction to the first of the series speaks of children whom and for whom they are told. They represent, he says, the young age of man true to his early loves, and have his unblunted edge of belief, a fresh appetite for marvels. Is it true? He says, is the great question children ask. I suspect that belief and appetite for marvels are here regarded as identical or as closely related. They are radically different, though the appetite for marvels is not at once or at first differentiated by a growing human mind from its general appetite. It seems fairly clear that Lang was using belief in its ordinary sense, belief that a thing exists or can happen in the real, primary, world. If so, then I fear that Lang's words, stripped of sentiment, can only imply that the teller of marvelous tales to children must, or may, or at any rate does trade on their credulity, on the lack of experience which makes it less easy for children to distinguish fact from fiction in particular cases, though the distinction in itself is fundamental to the sane human mind, and to fairy stories. Children are capable, of course, of literary belief, when the storymaker's art is good enough to produce it. That state of mind has been called willing suspension of disbelief. But this does not seem to me a good description of what happens. What really happens is that the storymaker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true, it accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it, while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken, the magic, or rather art, has failed. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from outside. If you are obliged, by kindliness or circumstance, to stay, then disbelief must be suspended, or stifled, otherwise listening and looking would become intolerable. But this suspension of disbelief is a substitute for the genuine thing, a subterfuge we use when condescending to games or make-believe, or when trying, more or less willingly, to find what virtue we can in the work of an art that has for us failed. A real enthusiast for cricket is in the enchanted state, secondary belief. When I watch a match, am on the lower level. I can achieve, more or less, willing suspension of disbelief, when I am held there and supported by some other motive that will keep away boredom, for instance, a wild, heraldic, preference for dark blue rather than light. This suspension of disbelief may thus be a somewhat tired, shabby, or sentimental state of mind, and so lean to the adult. I fancy it is often the state of adults in the presence of a fairy story. They are held there and supported by sentiment, memories of childhood, or notions of what childhood ought to be like. They think they ought to like the tale. But if they really liked it, for itself, they would not have to suspend disbelief, they would believe, in this sense. Now if Lang had meant anything like this, there might have been some truth in his words. It may be argued that it is easier to work the spell with children. Perhaps it is, though I am not sure of this. The appearance that it is so is often, I think, an adult illusion produced by children's humility, their lack of critical experience and vocabulary, and their voracity, proper to their rapid growth. They like or try to like what is given to them. If they do not like it, they cannot well express their dislike or give reasons for it, and so may conceal it, and they like a great mass of different things indiscriminately, without troubling to analyze the planes of their belief. In any case, I doubt if this potion, the enchantment of the effective fairy story, is really one of the kind that becomes blunted by use, less potent after repeated drafts. Is it true? Is the great question children ask, Lang said. They do ask that question, I know, and it is not one to be rashly or idly answered. But that question is hardly evidence of unblunted belief, or even of the desire for it. Most often it proceeds from the child's desire to know which kind of literature he is faced with. Children's knowledge of the world is often so small that they cannot judge, offhand and without help, between the fantastic, the strange, that is rare or remote facts, the nonsensical, and the merely grown-up, that is ordinary things of their parents' world, much of which still remains unexplored. But they recognize the different classes, and may like all of them at times. Of course the borders between them are often fluctuating or confused, But that is not only true for children. We all know the differences in kind, but we are not always sure how to place anything that we hear. A child may well believe a report that there are ogres in the next county. Many grown-up persons find it easy to believe of another country, and as for another planet, very few adults seem able to imagine it is peopled, if at all, by anything but monsters of iniquity. Now I was one of the children whom Andrew Lang was addressing. I was born at about the same time as the Green Fairy book, the children for whom he seemed to think that fairy stories were the equivalent of the adult novel, and of whom he said, their taste remains like the taste of their naked ancestors thousands of years ago, and they seem to like fairy tales better than history, poetry, geography, or arithmetic. But do we really know much about these naked ancestors, except that they were certainly not naked? Our fairy stories, however old certain elements in them may be, are certainly not the same as theirs. Yet if it is assumed that we have fairy stories because they did, then probably we have history, geography, poetry, and arithmetic because they liked these things too, as far as they could get them, and in so far as they had yet separated the many branches of their general interest in everything. And as for children of the present day, Lang's description does not fit my own memories, or my experience of children. Lang may have been mistaken about the children he knew, but if he was not, then at any rate children differ considerably, even within the narrow borders of Britain, and such generalizations which treat them as a class, disregarding their individual talents, and the influences of the countryside they live in, and their upbringing, are delusory. I had no special wish to believe. I wanted to know. Belief depended on the way in which stories were presented to me, by older people, or by the authors, or on the inherent tone and quality of the tale. But at no time can I remember that the enjoyment of a story was dependent on belief that such things could happen, or had happened, in real life. Fairy stories were plainly not primarily concerned with possibility, but with desirability. If they awakened desire, satisfying it while often whetting it unbearably, they succeeded. It is not necessary to be more explicit here, for I hope to say something later about this desire, a complex of many ingredients, some universal, some particular to modern men, including modern children, or even to certain kinds of men. I had no desire to have either dreams or adventures like Alice, and the amount of them merely amused me. I had very little desire to look for buried treasure or fight pirates, and Treasure Island left me cool. Red Indians were better, there were bows and arrows, I had and have a wholly unsatisfied desire to shoot well with a bow, and strange languages, and glimpses of an archaic mode of life, and, above all, forests and such stories. But the land of Merlin and Arthur was better than these, and best of all the nameless north of Sigurd of the Volsungs, and the Prince of all Dragons. Such lands were preeminently desirable. I never imagined that the dragon was of the same order as the horse. And that was not solely because I saw horses daily, but never even the footprint of a worm. The dragon had the trademark of fairy written plain upon him. In whatever world he had his being, it was another world. Fantasy, the making or glimpsing of other worlds, was the heart of the desire of fairy. I desired dragons with a profound desire. Of course, I in my timid body did not wish to have them in the neighborhood, intruding into my relatively safe world, in which it was, for instance, possible to read stories in peace of mind, free from fear. But the world that contained even the imagination of Fafnir was richer and more beautiful, at whatever cost of peril. The dweller in the quiet and fertile plains may hear of the tormented hills and the unharvested sea and long for them in his heart. For the heart is hard though the body be soft. All the same, important as I now perceive the fairy story element in early reading to have been, speaking for myself as a child, I can only say that a liking for fairy stories was not a dominant characteristic of early taste. A real taste for them awoke after nursery days, and after the years, few but long seeming, between learning to read and going to school. In that, I nearly wrote happy or golden, it was really a sad and troublous time. I liked many other things as well, or better, such as history, astronomy, botany, grammar, and etymology. I agreed with Lang's generalized children not at all in principle, and only in some points by accident. I was, for instance, insensitive to poetry, and skipped it if it came in tales. Poetry I discovered much later in Latin and Greek, and especially through being made to try and translate English verse into classical verse. A real taste for fairy stories was wakened by philology on the threshold of manhood, and quickened to full life by war. I have said, perhaps, more than enough on this point. At least it will be plain that in my opinion fairy stories should not be specially associated with children. They are associated with them, naturally, because children are human and fairy stories are a natural human taste, though not necessarily a universal one, accidentally, because fairy stories are a large part of the literary lumber that in latter-day Europe has been stuffed away in attics, unnaturally, because of erroneous sentiment about children, a sentiment that seems to increase with the decline in children. It is true that the age of childhood sentiment has produced some delightful books, especially charming, however, to adults, of the fairy kind or near to it, but it has also produced a dreadful undergrowth of stories written or adapted to what was or is conceived to be the measure of children's minds and needs. The old stories are mollified or bowdlerized, instead of being reserved. The imitations are often merely silly, pigwig generi without even the intrigue, or patronizing, or, deadliest of all, covertly sniggering, with an eye on the other grown-ups present. I will not accuse Andrew Lang of sniggering, but certainly he smiled to himself, and certainly too often he had an eye on the faces of other clever people over the heads of his child audience, to the very grave detriment of the Chronicles of Pantoflia. Dissent replied with vigor and justice to the prudish critics of his translations from Norse popular tales. Yet he committed the astonishing folly of particularly forbidding children to read the last two in his collection. That a man could study fairy stories and not learn better than that seems almost incredible. But neither criticism, rejoinder, nor prohibition would have been necessary if children had not unnecessarily been regarded as the inevitable readers of the book. I do not deny that there is a truth in Andrew Lang's words, sentimental though they may sound: he who would enter into the kingdom of fairy should have the heart of a little child. For that possession is necessary to all high adventure, into kingdoms both less and far greater than fairy. But humility and innocence, these things the heart of a child must mean in such a context, do not necessarily imply an uncritical wonder, nor indeed an uncritical tenderness. Chesterton once remarked that the children in whose company he saw Maeterlinck's blue bird were dissatisfied because it did not end with a day of judgment, and it was not revealed to the hero and the heroine that the dog had been faithful and the cat faithless. For children, he says, are innocent and love justice, while most of us are wicked and naturally prefer mercy. Andrew Lang was confused on this point. He was at pains to defend the slaying of the yellow dwarf by Prince Ricardo in one of his own fairy stories. I hate cruelty, he said, but that was in fair fight, sword in hand, and the dwarf, peace to his ashes, died in harness. Yet it is not clear that fair fight is less cruel than fair judgment, or that piercing a dwarf with a sword is more just than the execution of wicked kings and evil stepmothers, which Lang abjures. He sends the criminals, as he boasts, to retirement on ample pensions. That is mercy untempered by justice. It is true that this plea was not addressed to children but to parents and guardians, to whom Lang was recommending his own Prince Pregio and Prince Ricardo as suitable for their charges. It is parents and guardians who have classified fairy stories as juvenilia. And this is a small sample of the falsification of values that results. If we use child in a good sense, it is also legitimately a bad one. We must not allow that to push us into the sentimentality of only using adult or grown-up in a bad sense. It is also legitimately a good one. The process of growing older is not necessarily allied to growing wickeder, though the two do often happen together. Children are meant to grow up, and not to become Peter Pans. Not to lose innocence and wonder, but to proceed on the appointed journey, that journey upon which it is certainly not better to travel hopefully than to arrive, though we must travel hopefully if we are to arrive. But it is one of the lessons of fairy stories, if we can speak of the lessons of things that do not lecture, that on callow, lumpish, and selfish youth peril, sorrow, and the shadow of death can bestow dignity, and even sometimes wisdom. Let us not divide the human race into Eloi and Morlocks, pretty children, elves as the 18th century often idiotically called them, with their fairy tales, carefully pruned, and dark Morlocks tending their machines. If fairy story as a kind is worth reading at all, it is worthy to be written for and read by adults. They will, of course, put more in and get more out than children can. Then, as a branch of a genuine art, children may hope to get fairy stories fit for them to read and yet within their measure, as they may hope to get suitable introductions to poetry, history, and the sciences. Though it may be better for them to read some things, especially fairy stories, that are beyond their measure rather than short of it. Their books, like their clothes, should allow for growth, and their books at any rate should encourage it. Very well, then. If adults are to read fairy stories as a natural branch of literature, neither playing at being children, nor pretending to be choosing for children, nor being boys who would not grow up, what are the values and functions of this kind? That is, I think, the last and most important question. I have already hinted at some of my answers. First of all, if written with art, the prime value of fairy stories will simply be that value which, as literature, they share with other literary forms. But fairy stories offer also, in a peculiar degree or mode, these things: fantasy, recovery, escape, consolation, all things of which children have, as a rule, less need than older people. Most of them are nowadays very commonly considered to be bad for anybody. I will consider them briefly, and will begin with fantasy. Fantasy. The human mind is capable of forming mental images of things not actually present. The faculty of conceiving the images is, or was, naturally called imagination. But in recent times, in technical not normal language, imagination has often been held to be something higher than the mere image making, ascribed to the operations of fancy, a reduced and depreciatory form of the older word fantasy. An attempt is thus made to restrict, I should say misapply, imagination to the power of giving to ideal creations the inner consistency of reality. Ridiculous though it may be for one so ill-instructed to have an opinion on this critical matter, I venture to think the verbal distinction philologically inappropriate, and the analysis inaccurate. The mental power of image-making is one thing, or aspect, and it should appropriately be called imagination. The perception of the image, the grasp of its implications, and the control, which are necessary to a successful expression, may vary in vividness and strength, but this is a difference of degree in imagination, not a difference in kind. The achievement of the expression, which gives, or seems to give, the inner consistency of reality, is indeed another thing, or aspect, needing another name, art, the operative link between imagination and the final result, subcreation. For my present purpose I require a word which shall embrace both the sub-creative art in itself and a quality of strangeness and wonder in the expression, derived from the image, a quality essential to fairy story. I propose, therefore, to arrogate to myself the powers of Humpty Dumpty, and to use fantasy for this purpose, in a sense, that is, which combines with its older and higher use as an equivalent of imagination the derived notions of unreality, that is, of unlikeness to the primary world, of freedom from the domination of observed fact, in short of the fantastic. I am thus not only aware but glad of the etymological and semantic connections of fantasy with fantastic, with images of things that are not only not actually present, but which are indeed not to be found in our primary world at all, or are generally believed not to be found there. But while admitting that, I do not assent to the depreciative tone. That the images are of things not in the primary world, if that indeed is possible, is a virtue, not a vice. Fantasy, in this sense, is, I think, not a lower but a higher form of art, indeed the most nearly pure form, and so, when achieved, the most potent. Fantasy, of course, starts out with an advantage, arresting strangeness. But that advantage has been turned against it, and has contributed to its disrepute. Many people dislike being arrested. They dislike any meddling with the primary world, or such small glimpses of it as are familiar to them. They, therefore, stupidly and even maliciously confound fantasy with dreaming, in which there is no art, and with mental disorders, in which there is not even control, with delusion and hallucination. But the error or malice, engendered by disquiet and consequent dislike, is not the only cause of this confusion. Fantasy has also an essential drawback: it is difficult to achieve. Fantasy may be, as I think, not less but more subcreative, but at any rate it is found in practice that the inner consistency of reality is more difficult to produce, the more unlike are the images and the rearrangements of primary material to the actual arrangements of the primary world. It is easier to produce this kind of reality with more sober material. Fantasy thus, too often, remains undeveloped. It is and has been used frivolously, or only half seriously, or merely for decoration. It remains merely fanciful. Anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say the green sun. Many can then imagine or picture it. But that is not enough, though it may already be a more potent thing than many a thumbnail sketch or transcript of life that receives literary praise. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks. But when they are attempted and any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art, indeed narrative art, story making in its primary and most potent mode. In human art, fantasy is a thing best left to words, to true literature. In painting, for instance, the visible presentation of the fantastic image is technically too easy. The hand tends to outrun the mind, even to overthrow it. Silliness or morbidity are frequent results. It is a misfortune that drama, an art fundamentally distinct from literature, should so commonly be considered together with it, or as a branch of it. Among these misfortunes we may reckon the depreciation of fantasy. For in part at least this depreciation is due to the natural desire of critics to cry up the forms of literature or imagination that they themselves, innately or by training, prefer. And criticism in a country that has produced so great a drama, and possesses the works of William Shakespeare, tends to be far too dramatic. But drama is naturally hostile to fantasy. Fantasy, even of the simplest kind, hardly ever succeeds in drama, when that is presented as it should be, visibly and audibly acted. Fantastic forms are not to be counterfeited. Men dressed up as talking animals may achieve buffoonery or mimicry, but they do not achieve fantasy. This is, I think, well illustrated by the failure of the bastard form, pantomime. The nearer it is to dramatized fairy story, the worse it is. It is only tolerable when the plot and its fantasy are reduced to a mere vestigiary framework for farce, and no belief of any kind in any part of the performance is required or expected of anybody. This is, of course, partly due to the fact that the producers of drama have to, or try to, work with mechanism to represent either fantasy or magic. I once saw a so-called children's pantomime, the straight story of Puss in Boots, with even the metamorphosis of the ogre into a mouse. Had this been mechanically successful, it would either have terrified the spectators or else have been just a turn of high-class conjuring. As it was, though done with some ingenuity of lighting, disbelief had not so much to be suspended as hanged, drawn, and quartered. In Macbeth, when it is read, I find the witches tolerable. They have a narrative function and some hint of dark significance, though they are vulgarized, poor things of their kind. They are almost intolerable in the play. They would be quite intolerable, if I were not fortified by some memory of them as they are in the story as read. I am told that I should feel differently if I had the mind of the period, with its witch hunts and witch trials. But that is to say, if I regarded the witches as possible, indeed likely, in the primary world, in other words, if they cease to be fantasy. That argument concedes the point. To be dissolved, or to be degraded, is the likely fate of fantasy when a dramatist tries to use it, even such a dramatist as Shakespeare. Macbeth is indeed a work by a playwright who ought, at least on this occasion, to have written a story, if he had the skill or patience for that art. A reason, more important, I think, than the inadequacy of stage effects, is this: drama has, of its very nature, already attempted a kind of bogus, or shall I say at least substitute, magic, the visible and audible presentation of imaginary men in a story. That is in itself an attempt to counterfeit the magician's wand. To introduce, even with mechanical success, into this quasi-magical secondary world a further fantasy or magic is to demand, as it were, an inner or tertiary world. It is a world too much. To make such a thing may not be impossible. I have never seen it done with success. But at least it cannot be claimed as the proper mode of drama, in which walking and talking people have been found to be the natural instruments of art and illusion. For this precise reason, that the characters, and even the scenes, are in drama not imagined but actually beheld, drama is, even though it uses a similar material, words, verse, plot, an art fundamentally different from narrative art. Thus, if you prefer drama to literature, as many literary critics plainly do, or form your critical theories primarily from dramatic critics, or even from drama, you are apt to misunderstand pure story making, and to constrain it to the limitations of stage plays. You are, for instance, likely to prefer characters, even the basest and dullest, to things. Very little about trees as trees can be got into a play. Now fairy and drama, those plays which according to abundant records the elves have often presented to men, can produce fantasy with a realism and immediacy beyond the compass of any human mechanism. As a result, their usual effect, upon a man, is to go beyond secondary belief. If you are present at a fairy and drama, you yourself are, or think that you are, bodily inside its secondary world. The experience may be very similar to dreaming and has, it would seem, sometimes, by men, been confounded with it. But in fairy and drama you are in a dream that some other mind is weaving, and the knowledge of that alarming fact may slip from your grasp. To experience directly a secondary world, the potion is too strong, and you give to it primary belief, however marvelous the events. You are deluded. Whether that is the intention of the elves, always or at any time, is another question. They at any rate are not themselves deluded. This is for them a form of art, and distinct from wizardry or magic, properly so called. They do not live in it, though they can, perhaps, afford to spend more time at it than human artists can. The primary world, reality, of elves and men is the same, if differently valued and perceived. We need a word for this elvish craft, but all the words that have been applied to it have been blurred and confused with other things. Magic is ready to hand, and I have used it above, p. 39, but I should not have done so. Magic should be reserved for the operations of the magician. Art is the human process that produces, by the way, it is not its only or ultimate object, secondary belief. Art of the same sort, if more skilled and effortless, the elves can also use, or so the reports seem to show, but the more potent and specially elvish craft I will, for lack of a less debatable word, call enchantment. Enchantment produces a secondary world into which both designer and spectator can enter, to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside, but in its purity it is artistic in desire and purpose. Magic produces, or pretends to produce, an alteration in the primary world. It does not matter by whom it is said to be practiced, fey or mortal, it remains distinct from the other two. It is not an art but a technique, its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills. To the elvish craft, enchantment, fantasy aspires, and when it is successful of all forms of human art most nearly approaches. At the heart of many man-made stories of the elves lies, open or concealed, pure or alloyed, the desire for a living, realized sub-creative art, which, however much it may outwardly resemble it, is inwardly wholly different from the greed for self-centered power which is the mark of the mere magician. Of this desire the elves, in their better, but still perilous, part, are largely made, and it is from them that we may learn what is the central desire and aspiration of human fantasy, even if the elves are, all the more in so far as they are, only a product of fantasy itself. That creative desire is only cheated by counterfeits, whether the innocent but clumsy devices of the human dramatist, or the malevolent frauds of the magicians. In this world it is for men unsatisfiable, and so imperishable. Uncorrupted, it does not seek delusion nor bewitchment and domination, it seeks shared enrichment, partners in making and delight, not slaves. To many, fantasy, this sub-creative art which plays strange tricks with the world and all that is in it, combining nouns and redistributing adjectives, has seemed suspect, if not illegitimate. To some it has seemed at least a childish folly, a thing only for peoples or for persons in their youth. As for its legitimacy I will say no more than to quote a brief passage from a letter I once wrote to a man who described myth and fairy story as lies, though to do him justice he was kind enough and confused enough to call fairy story making breathing a lie through silver. Dear sir, I said, although now long estranged. Man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned. And keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white, to many hues, and endlessly combined, in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled, with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and so the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused, that right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. Fantasy is a natural human activity. It certainly does not destroy or even insult reason, and it does not either blunt the appetite for, nor obscure the perception of, scientific verity. On the contrary, the keener and the clearer is the reason, the better fantasy will it make. If men were ever in a state in which they did not want to know or could not perceive truth, facts or evidence, then fantasy would languish until they were cured. If they ever get into that state, it would not seem at all impossible, fantasy will perish, and become morbid delusion. For creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact, but not a slavery to it. So upon logic was founded the nonsense that displays itself in the tales and rhymes of Lewis Carroll. If men really could not distinguish between frogs and men, fairy stories about frog kings would not have arisen. Fantasy can, of course, be carried to excess. It can be ill done. It can be put to evil uses. It may even delude the minds out of which it came. But of what human thing in this fallen world is that not true? Men have conceived not only of elves, but they have imagined gods, and worshipped them, even worshipped those most deformed by their author's own evil. But they have made false gods out of other materials, their notions, their banners, their monies, even their sciences and their social and economic theories have demanded human sacrifice. Abusus non tollit usum. Fantasy remains a human right, we make in our measure and in our derivative mode, because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. Recovery, escape, consolation. As for old age, whether personal or belonging to the times in which we live, it may be true, as is often supposed, that this imposes disabilities, cf. p. 59. But it is in the main an idea produced by the mere study of fairy stories. The analytic study of fairy stories is as bad a preparation for the enjoying or the writing of them as would be the historical study of the drama of all lands and times for the enjoyment or writing of stage plays. The study may indeed become depressing. It is easy for the student to feel that with all his labor he is collecting only a few leaves, many of them now torn or decayed, from the countless foliage of the tree of tales, with which the forest of days is carpeted. It seems vain to add to the litter. Who can design a new leaf? The patterns from bud to unfolding, and the colors from spring to autumn were all discovered by men long ago. But that is not true. The seed of the tree can be replanted in almost any soil, even in one so smoke-ridden, as Lang said, as that of England. Spring is, of course, not really less beautiful because we have seen or heard of other like events, never from world's beginning to world's end the same event. Each leaf, of oak and ash and thorn, is a unique embodiment of the pattern, and for some this very year may be the embodiment, the first ever seen and recognized, though oaks have put forth leaves for countless generations of men. We do not, or need not, despair of drawing because all lines must be either curved or straight, nor of painting because there are only three primary colors. We may indeed be older now, in so far as we are heirs in enjoyment or in practice of many generations of ancestors in the arts. In this inheritance of wealth there may be a danger of boredom or of anxiety to be original, and that may lead to a distaste for fine drawing, delicate pattern, and pretty colors, or else to mere manipulation and over-elaboration of old material, clever and heartless. But the true road of escape from such weariness is not to be found in the willfully awkward, clumsy, or misshapen, not in making all things dark or unremittingly violent, nor in the mixing of colors on through subtlety to drabness, and the fantastical complication of shapes to the point of silliness and on towards delirium. Before we reach such states we need recovery. We should look at green again, and be startled anew, but not blinded, by blue and yellow and red. We should meet the centaur and the dragon, and then perhaps suddenly behold, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs, and horses, and wolves. This recovery fairy stories help us to make. In that sense only a taste for them may make us, or keep us, childish. Recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are, or were, meant to see them as things apart from ourselves. We need, in any case, to clean our windows, so that the thing seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. Of all faces those of our familiares are the ones both most difficult to play fantastic tricks with, and most difficult really to see with fresh attention, perceiving their likeness and unlikeness, that they are faces, and yet unique faces. This triteness is really the penalty of appropriation. The things that are trite, or, in a bad sense, familiar, are the things that we have appropriated, legally or mentally. We say we know them. They have become like the things which once attracted us by their glitter, or their color, or their shape, and we laid hands on them, and then locked them in our hoard, acquired them, and acquiring ceased to look at them. Of course, fairy stories are not the only means of recovery, or prophylactic against loss. Humility is enough. And there is, especially for the humble, morific, or Chestertonian fantasy. Morific is a fantastic word, but it could be seen written up in every town in this land. It is coffee room, viewed from the inside through a glass door, as it was seen by Dickens on a dark London day, and it was used by Chesterton to denote the queerness of things that have become trite, when they are seen suddenly from a new angle. That kind of fantasy most people would allow to be wholesome enough, and it can never lack for material. But it has, I think, only a limited power, for the reason that recovery of freshness of vision is its only virtue. The word morific may cause you suddenly to realize that England is an utterly alien land, lost either in some remote past age glimpsed by history, or in some strange dim future to be reached only by a time machine, to see the amazing oddity and interest of its inhabitants and their customs and feeding habits, but it cannot do more than that, act as a time telescope focused on one spot. Creative fantasy, because it is mainly trying to do something else, make something new, may open your hoard and let all the locked things fly away like caged birds. The gems all turn into flowers or flames, and you will be warned that all you had, or knew, was dangerous and potent, not really effectively chained, free and wild, no more yours than they were you. The fantastic elements in verse and prose of other kinds, even when only decorative or occasional, help in this release. But not so thoroughly as a fairy story, a thing built on or about fantasy, of which fantasy is the core. Fantasy is made out of the primary world, but a good craftsman loves his material, and has a knowledge and feeling for clay, stone and wood which only the art of making can give. By the forging of grand cold iron was revealed, by the making of Pegasus horses were ennobled, in the trees of the sun and moon root and stock, flower and fruit are manifested in glory. And actually fairy stories deal largely, or, the better ones, mainly, with simple or fundamental things, untouched by fantasy, but these simplicities are made all the more luminous by their setting. For the story maker who allows himself to be free with nature can be her lover not her slave. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of the words, and the wonder of the things, such as stone, and wood, and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. I will now conclude by considering escape and consolation, which are naturally closely connected. Though fairy stories are of course by no means the only medium of escape, they are today one of the most obvious and, to some, outrageous forms of escapist literature, and it is thus reasonable to attach to a consideration of them some considerations of this term escape in criticism generally. I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories, and since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used, a tone for which the uses of the word outside literary criticism give no warrant at all. In what the misusers are fond of calling real life, escape is evidently as a rule very practical, and may even be heroic. In real life it is difficult to blame it, unless it fails. In criticism it would seem to be the worse the better it succeeds. Evidently we are faced by a misuse of words, and also by a confusion of thought. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if, when he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls? The world outside has not become less real because the prisoner cannot see it. In using escape in this way the critics have chosen the wrong word, and, what is more, they are confusing, not always by sincere error, the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. Just so a party spokesman might have labeled departure from the misery of the Führers or any other Reich and even criticism of it as treachery. In the same way these critics, to make confusion worse, and so to bring into contempt their opponents, stick their label of scorn not only onto desertion, but onto real escape, and what are often its companions, disgust, anger, condemnation, and revolt. Not only do they confound the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter, but they would seem to prefer the acquiescence of the quisling to the resistance of the patriot. To such thinking you have only to say the land you loved is doomed to excuse any treachery, indeed to glorify it. For a trifling instance, not to mention, indeed not to parade, electric street lamps of mass-produced pattern in your tale is escape, in that sense. But it may, almost certainly does, proceed from a considered disgust for so typical a product of the robot age, that combines elaboration and ingenuity of means with ugliness, and, often with inferiority of result. These lamps may be excluded from the tale simply because they are bad lamps, and it is possible that one of the lessons to be learnt from the story is the realization of this fact. But out comes the big stick, electric lamps have come to stay, they say. Long ago Chesterton truly remarked that, as soon as he heard that anything had come to stay, he knew that it would be very soon replaced, indeed regarded as pitiably obsolete and shabby. The march of science, its tempo quickened by the needs of war, goes inexorably on, making some things obsolete, and foreshadowing new developments in the utilization of electricity, an advertisement. This says the same thing only more menacingly. The electric street lamp may indeed be ignored, simply because it is so insignificant and transient. Fairy stories, at any rate, have many more permanent and fundamental things to talk about. Lightning, for example. The escapist is not so subservient to the whims of evanescent fashion as these opponents. He does not make things, which it may be quite rational to regard as bad, his masters or his gods by worshipping them as inevitable, even inexorable. And his opponents, so easily contemptuous, have no guarantee that he will stop there. He might rouse men to pull down the street lamps. Escapism has another and even wickeder face, reaction. Not long ago, incredible though it may seem, I heard a clerk of Oxenford declare that he welcomed the proximity of mass production robot factories, and the roar of self-obstructive mechanical traffic, because it brought his university into contact with real life. He may have meant that the way men were living and working in the 20th century was increasing in barbarity at an alarming rate, and that the loud demonstration of this in the streets of Oxford might serve as a warning that it is not possible to preserve for long an oasis of sanity in a desert of unreason by mere fences, without actual offensive action, practical and intellectual. I fear he did not. In any case, the expression real life in this context seems to fall short of academic standards. The notion that motor cars are more alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. How real, how startlingly alive is a factory chimney compared with an elm tree, poor obsolete thing, insubstantial dream of an escapist. For my part, I cannot convince myself that the roof of Bletchley Station is more real than the clouds. And as an artifact I find it less inspiring than the legendary Dome of Heaven. The bridge to Platform 4 is to me less interesting than Bivrist guarded by Heimdall with the Gjallarhorn. From the wildness of my heart I cannot exclude the question whether railway engineers, if they had been brought up on more fantasy, might not have done better with all their abundant means than they commonly do. Fairy stories might be, I guess, better masters of arts than the academic person I have referred to. Much that he, I must suppose, and others, certainly, would call serious literature is no more than play under a glass roof by the side of a municipal swimming bath. Fairy stories may invent monsters that fly the air or dwell in the deep, but at least they do not try to escape from heaven or the sea. And if we leave aside for a moment fantasy, I do not think that the reader or the maker of fairy stories need even be ashamed of the escape of archaism, of preferring not dragons but horses, castles, sailing ships, bows and arrows, not only elves, but knights and kings and priests. For it is after all possible for a rational man, after reflection, quite unconnected with fairy story or romance, to arrive at the condemnation, implicit at least in the mere silence of escapist literature, of progressive things like factories, or the machine guns and bombs that appear to be their most natural and inevitable, dare we say inexorable, products. The rawness and ugliness of modern European life, that real life whose contact we should welcome, is the sign of a biological inferiority, of an insufficient or false reaction to environment. The maddest castle that ever came out of a giant's bag in a wild Gaelic story is not only much less ugly than a robot factory, it is also, to use a very modern phrase, in a very real sense a great deal more real. Why should we not escape from or condemn the grim Assyrian absurdity of top hats, or the Morlockian horror of factories? They are condemned even by the writers of that most escapist form of all literature, stories of science fiction. These prophets often foretell, and many seem to yearn for, a world like one big glass-roofed railway station. But from them it is as a rule very hard to gather what men in such a world town will do. They may abandon the full Victorian panoply for loose garments, with zip fasteners, but will use this freedom mainly, it would appear, in order to play with mechanical toys in the soon cloying game of moving at high speed. To judge by some of these tales, they will still be as lustful, vengeful, and greedy as ever, and the ideals of their idealists hardly reach farther than the splendid notion of building more towns of the same sort on other planets. It is indeed an age of improved means to deteriorated ends. It is part of the essential malady of such days, producing the desire to escape, not indeed from life, but from our present time and self-made misery, that we are acutely conscious both of the ugliness of our works, and of their evil. So that to us evil and ugliness seem indissolubly allied. We find it difficult to conceive of evil and beauty together. The fear of the beautiful fay that ran through the elder ages almost eludes our grasp. Even more alarming, goodness is itself bereft of its proper beauty. In fairy one can indeed conceive of an ogre who possesses a castle hideous as a nightmare, for the evil of the ogre wills it so, but one cannot conceive of a house built with a good purpose, an inn, a hostel for travelers, the hall of a virtuous and noble king, that is yet sickeningly ugly. At the present day it would be rash to hope to see one that was not, unless it was built before our time. This, however, is the modern and special, or accidental, escapist aspect of fairy stories, which they share with romances, and other stories out of or about the past. Many stories out of the past have only become escapist in their appeal through surviving from a time when men were as a rule delighted with the work of their hands into our time, when many men feel disgust with man-made things. But there are also other and more profound escapisms that have always appeared in fairy tale and legend. There are other things more grim and terrible to fly from than the noise, stench, ruthlessness, and extravagance of the internal combustion engine. There are hunger, thirst, poverty, pain, sorrow, injustice, death. And even when men are not facing hard things such as these, there are ancient limitations from which fairy stories offer a sort of escape, and old ambitions and desires, touching the very roots of fantasy, to which they offer a kind of satisfaction and consolation. Some are pardonable weaknesses or curiosities, such as the desire to visit, free as a fish, the deep sea, or the longing for the noiseless, gracious, economical flight of a bird, that longing which the aeroplane cheats, except in rare moments, seen high and by wind and distance noiseless, turning in the sun, that is, precisely when imagined and not used. There are profounder wishes, such as the desire to converse with other living things. On this desire, as ancient as the fall, is largely founded the talking of beasts and creatures in fairy tales, and especially the magical understanding of their proper speech. This is the root, and not the confusion attributed to the minds of men of the unrecorded past, an alleged absence of the sense of separation of ourselves from beasts. A vivid sense of that separation is very ancient, but also a sense that it was a severance, a strange fate and a guilt lies on us. Other creatures are like other realms with which man has broken off relations, and sees now only from the outside at a distance, being at war with them, or on the terms of an uneasy armistice. There are a few men who are privileged to travel abroad a little, others must be content with travelers' tales. Even about frogs. In speaking of that rather odd but widespread fairy story the Frog King, Max Muller asked in his prim way, how came such a story ever to be invented? Human beings were, we may hope, at all times sufficiently enlightened to know that a marriage between a frog and the daughter of a queen was absurd. Indeed, we may hope so. For if not, there would be no point in this story at all, depending as it does essentially on the sense of the absurdity. Folklore origins, or guesses about them, are here quite beside the point. It is of little avail to consider totemism. For certainly, whatever customs or beliefs about frogs and wells lie behind this story, the frog shape was and is preserved in the fairy story precisely because it was so queer and the marriage absurd, indeed abominable. Though, of course, in the versions which concern us, Gaelic, German, English, there is in fact no wedding between a princess and a frog. The frog was an enchanted prince. And the point of the story lies not in thinking frogs possible mates, but in the necessity of keeping promises, even those with intolerable consequences, that, together with observing prohibitions, runs through all fairyland. This is one of the notes of the horns of Elfland, and not a dim note. And lastly, there is the oldest and deepest desire, the great escape, the escape from death. Fairy stories provide many examples and modes of this, which might be called the genuine escapist, or, I would say, fugitive spirit. But so do other stories, notably those of scientific inspiration, and so do other studies. Fairy stories are made by men, not by fairies. The human stories of the elves are doubtless full of the escape from deathlessness. But our stories cannot be expected always to rise above our common level. They often do. Few lessons are taught more clearly in them than the burden of that kind of immortality, or rather endless serial living, to which the fugitive would fly. For the fairy story is especially apt to teach such things, of old and still today. Death is the theme that most inspired George MacDonald. But the consolation of fairy tales has another aspect than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function, but the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I'll call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale, and its highest function. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale, this joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist, nor fugitive. In its fairy tale, or otherworld, setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and in so far as evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. It is the mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art, and having a peculiar quality. Even modern fairy stories can produce this effect sometimes. It is not an easy thing to do, it depends on the whole story, which is the setting of the turn, and yet it reflects a glory backwards. A tale that in any measure succeeds in this point has not wholly failed, whatever flaws it may possess, and whatever mixture or confusion of purpose. It happens even in Andrew Lang's own fairy story, Prince Pregio, unsatisfactory in many ways as that is. When each knight came alive and lifted his sword and shouted, "Long live Prince Pregio," the joy has a little of that strange mythical fairy story quality, greater than the event described. It would have none in Lang's tale, if the event described were not a piece of more serious fairy story fantasy than the main bulk of the story, which is in general more frivolous, having the half-mocking smile of the courtly, sophisticated Conde. Far more powerful and poignant is the effect in a serious tale of fairy. In such stories, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy, and heart's desire, that for a moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through. 7 long years I served for thee. The glassy hill I clamb for thee. The bluety shirt I rang for thee. And wilt thou not walk in and turn to me? He heard and turned to her. Epilogue. This joy which I have selected as the mark of the true fairy story, or romance, or as the seal upon it, merits more consideration. Probably every writer making a secondary world, a fantasy, every sub-creator, wishes in some measure to be a real maker, or hopes that he is drawing on reality, hopes that the peculiar quality of this secondary world, if not all the details, are derived from reality, or are flowing into it. If he indeed achieves a quality that can fairly be described by the dictionary definition, inner consistency of reality, it is difficult to conceive how this can be, if the work does not in some way partake of reality. The peculiar quality of the joy in successful fantasy can thus be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. It is not only a consolation for the sorrow of this world, but a satisfaction, and an answer to that question, is it true? The answer to this question that I gave at first was, quite rightly, if you have built your little world well, yes, it is true in that world. That is enough for the artist, or the artist part of the artist. But in the eucatastrophe we see in a brief vision that the answer may be greater, it may be a far-off gleam or echo of evangelium in the real world. The use of this word gives a hint of my epilogue. It is a serious and dangerous matter. It is presumptuous of me to touch upon such a theme, but if by grace what I say has in any respect any validity, it is, of course, only one facet of a truth incalculably rich, finite only because the capacity of man for whom this was done is finite. I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt-making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect, as to others, of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mythical in their perfect, self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world, the desire and aspiration of sub-creation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. It is not difficult to imagine the peculiar excitement and joy that one would feel if any specially beautiful fairy story were found to be primarily true, its narrative to be history, without thereby necessarily losing the mythical or allegorical significance that it had possessed. It is not difficult, for one is not called upon to try and conceive anything of a quality unknown. The joy would have exactly the same quality, if not the same degree, as the joy which the turn in a fairy story gives. Such joy has the very taste of primary truth. Otherwise its name would not be joy, it looks forward, or backward, the direction in this regard is unimportant, to the great eucatastrophe. The Christian joy, the Gloria, is of the same kind, but it is preeminently, infinitely, if our capacity were not finite, high and joyous. But this story is supreme, and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord, of angels, and of men, and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. But in God's kingdom the presence of the greatest does not depress the small. Redeemed man is still man. Story, fantasy, still go on, and should go on. The Evangelium has not abrogated legends, it has hallowed them, especially the happy ending. The Christian has still to work, with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die, but he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose, which can be redeemed. So great is the bounty with which he has been treated that he may now, perhaps, fairly dare to guess that in fantasy he may actually assist in the effoliation and multiple enrichment of creation. All tales may come true, and yet, at the last, redeemed, they may be as like and as unlike the forms that we give them as man, finally redeemed, will be like and unlike the fallen that we know.